I think this is very important public understanding. So I'm going to see if there's someone in the audience who wants to pose a question. Oh, there's Robert. Hi, Robert.
Hello. It's not so much a question as a few comments, which I have to put in. I mean, since you were working in the nuclear industry, like Patrick, I do wonder, in fact, if the US had not used nuclear weapons in 1945, would there be much less fear of nuclear power? And also, one of my reasons for being a fan of nuclear fission power at this point is that that would be a good incentive to use up that fissile material that's currently used for bombs, in the sense that there are potential reactor designs where this highly fissile material is a good seed for, the rest of the reaction. Anyway, that's just that comment. The other thing is, there's a Chinese writer called Han Suyin, and in a novel of hers, whose title I forget, she comments that, no societies change overnight. It does take many, many generations. So I wonder how long this kind of political process is going to take. And also, when I read the profile that Rajesh put on the website, I was rather touched, actually. I mean, he's a man after my own heart, so to speak. But the idea that we have one or two... The idea that we have 1 or 2 generations to resolve it, I would disagree with. I think at most, maybe we have 1, maybe we have even less than that. And the other thing is, the processes that are happening, which you're discussing, I don't kind of really grasp them. I think you have to kind of work on it a lot before you see everything fits together. But what I see as the good thing is that it provides a framework for when the panic sets in. So at some point, the panic will set in, and then everybody falls back. What can we do? What can we do? And then the framework will be useful. Otherwise, I have got no questions, but those are my comments. And if you'd like to comment. Well, I'll just say, actually, I put in, I will say one more thing. Because it's rather lengthy, I put in some comment on the situation in the UK. And this gives me disappointment and satisfaction at the same time. So in the UK, with the change of government, in a way, we've had a downgrading of dealing with climate change. This has annoyed me a lot. So for instance, there were good subsidies for renewables, and they've suddenly been withdrawn at a rate which those companies which were developing it cannot deal with. They've gone bankrupt, so they've shut up. And it's even been taken out of the title, climate change has even been taken out of the title of the department that was dealing with it. Now it's just got energy. Well, energy can be anything, can't it? But at the grassroots, there's a lot of stuff happening. So I mentioned right at the end, I insulated my own house with 100 mil of polystyrene, and it's wrapped and rendered and everything. It's very good. It makes it a lot warmer, as well as using less fuel. And all sorts of other things. Near me, there's a big solar PV farm. There's an anaerobic digester producing electricity, and so on and so on. So at the bottom end, a lot is happening, and that's what gives me hope. So it's not so much, I think the political side, as I say, is the framework to fall back on when the panic really sets in. But also we'll have all this grassroots activity, R&D development, which we'll be able to plug into straight away and maybe resolve the problem. Anyway, back to you before Rajesh asks to sing anything.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, sure. So I guess just to comment on some of Robert's comments. Thank you very much for sharing all of that. On your point about nuclear weapons and the fear of nuclear power in the United States, you posed the question about if the United States hadn't dropped those bombs during World War II, maybe there wouldn't be so much fear. And I think you're probably right. But I think the flip side of that is we may not have had the technology development of a peaceful purpose for nuclear energy without the military application of it, or maybe it wouldn't have come about as quickly. The first commercial nuclear power plant in the United States was developed actually by the Navy. If you've heard any stories about Admiral Rickover, he was a really interesting guy, but he pushed for this peaceful application of nuclear power after World War II. And there's documentaries on him. I recommend that you take a look at his biography. But I guess the question I pose back is, would we have this technology developed so quickly as nuclear power plants? The other thing that I think I'd like to comment on is the situation in the United Kingdom with the change of government and all the sort of the great grassroots research and movements that are going on with climate change, and the issue of how much time do we have to address this problem? Is it one generation? Is it 2 generations? Like, is this dire right now? I think that it's good to be, like, I agree that it's good that we're setting this framework of global action with the UNFCCC. And it's really important that things continue to happen with climate action locally. So I think it's really important for all of those grassroots movements and research to continue, because you're right, when the government changes so much, I mean, the same thing sort of happens in the United States. Sometimes we're really focused on environmental protection, and sometimes we're more worried about the economy, and it changes very quickly. So I think it's important to sort of have this this constant level of action going on, even if it's not in sort of the limelight, And as far as how much time we have to resolve this, I think there's plenty of discussion and disagreement to be had on that issue. But one of the things about climate change and a lot of environmental issues is that nothing happens in a vacuum. And things that you do for environmental issues that are pressing right now might help with climate change down the road. So, for example, China has a really big issue right now with air pollution, but by maybe closing down some of their coal plants, maybe building some or starting some nuclear power projects to help with air pollution right now is going to help with climate change down the road. So it's always interesting to see these co-benefit solutions to environmental issues. And I think it's really important to not just focus on the climate change issue, but where can you sort of double dip and sort of develop policy that can help across environmental issues.
Great, thanks, Katie. So a couple of follow-on questions. I really like this co-benefit logic that you just mentioned. Just last week, New Delhi, the city I grew up in, air pollution crossed 1,000 parts per million, right? I mean, it is 15 times higher than what's safe. So the city has been shut down for 3 days. And so in countries like India, it's clear that climate change is not the only environmental issue, and therefore, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, it's a rapidly developing country, so there are certain needs that need to be met. So tell us a little bit more about how policy, especially the kind of technology-based policy that you are looking at, can help us sort of manage those complexities.
Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm inclined to do is put a plug in here for my own research. So I think in order to manage these complexities, it's really important to have research that's cognizant of multiple environmental issues. So, for example, the research that I'm doing as part of my thesis work here at MIT for my master's degree is I'm looking at national climate policy in China and how it affects some of their environmental goals as well as some of their sustainable development goals. So I work with some economists who have a model of China's economy down to the province level. And we're basically simulating a decarbonization of their economy through a carbon price or a cap and trade sort of program. And I know that China's kind of having issues getting that program off the ground, even though they announced it about a year ago. But it's just sort of a way of simulating what their economy would look like if it were a little bit less carbon intensive. And so I'm using information on the economy to look at what happens with mercury pollution in China with a climate policy that results in decarbonization. And then on the sustainable development side of things, I'm using this new economic indicator called the Inclusive Wealth Index. And I'm looking at whether or not this indicator can be used to tell us some information on how sustainable a climate policy is over time. And that index looks at some human factors like health and education. It looks at information on natural resources. So, you know, fossil fuels like coal, as well as like the value of cropland and forests, which are a little bit harder to monetize or to quantify. And then the indicator also looks at produced capital, so actually like physical built stuff that you normally think about if you're looking at an economic indicator like GDP.
Mm-hmm. So Kurt's got a follow-on question, which is, I mean, you know, China is trying to meet its own goals, but it's also the manufacturing sort of hub for the rest of the world, right? So how much of their climate contribution is really a consequence of a globalized economy? So even though they are the ones who are, like the direct contribution to carbon emissions is from China, if we were not buying the things that they were making, then they wouldn't be making those contributions in the first place, right? So how do you factor those in?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. You're almost getting into issues of globalization and trade deals, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with that kind of question. But I think what's important to highlight here is bilateral action. So the fact that a lot of the world relies on China for various, you know, products that are highly energy intensive to manufacture. I think it's important to have bilateral agreements like China and the United States had back in 2014 or 2015, right before the Paris Agreement, that kind of get China on board, and are also inclusive of many other countries as well. So we don't want to push all of the responsibility for mitigating and adapting to climate change onto China. So, you know, that's why it's important to sort of have these bilateral actions that say, hey, if you, I mean, we use all of your goods, but if you guys act on climate change, then we're going to work really hard to act on climate change too. So it's sort of this, you want to create this atmosphere of like everybody's in it together. You don't want to push all of this responsibility onto one country.
But we like blaming, you know, we like finding one bad guy who can, you know, unfortunately life is not like a Hollywood movie. But it does raise this issue, which is, you know, the current commitments are definitely not enough to get us below 2 degrees. So what is that ratcheting process going to look like? And, you know, how are we going to play it out as the years and decades go from here?
Yeah, so that's actually an issue that's going to be very interesting to follow at the Marrakech Climate Conference, is looking at that ratcheting mechanism. Underneath of that, I guess there's a couple of issues. There's reporting requirements for the nationally determined contributions. So one of the things that's going to happen is, I think at Marrakech, the member countries are going to come up with some guidelines for what to include in the nationally determined contributions, so that they're a little bit easier to compare and to get all the information that you would need for a global stocktake. I think another important part of the global stocktake that I mentioned a little bit earlier is this idea of the information that you use to to make that assessment, where is it going to come from? So one source might be the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think maybe another source is going to be sort of third-party researchers as well, for doing that assessment, because once again, you kind of want to keep your information as objective as you possibly can, if possible. And so I guess the simple answer to your question is that we do not know what that global stocktake and that ratcheting mechanism are going to look like yet. That's one of the challenges I think that we're going to have with implementation of the Paris Agreement.
So you mentioned that it's one of the topics that we're going to be discussing in Marrakech. Is it the biggest topic, or are there others? So tell us maybe a little bit about what's going to happen over the next few days too.
Sure. Let me just make sure I have my notes in front of me here and see if there's anything else that we're going to be paying attention to. So I mentioned the uniform set of features for the nationally determined contributions. That's going to be important. Also is this idea of the loss and damage mechanism, which I haven't talked about yet. So this came up in the conference in Warsaw a couple years back, and the loss and damage mechanism is built on this framework of what happens to countries that can't act quickly enough to adapt to climate change, and where mitigation steps might not be enough. What happens to those countries? And so I think a big part of the loss and damage mechanism is finance and compensating these countries where that might happen to, because there's many countries that are already dealing with the impacts of climate change, especially where you have sea level rise. So I think that loss and damage mechanism is going to be fleshed out a little bit more, and it's going to kind of lay the groundwork for what we see in the future from this mechanism. Also, capacity building is going to be a focus at Marrakech and the Paris Agreement into the future. So this is the idea that some developing countries don't necessarily have the means in their government with which to implement the Paris Agreement. So I think that's sort of the responsibility of the UNFCCC to help governments to build these institutions that can implement the Paris Agreement. And then also underneath of capacity building is the issue of technology transfer. So as developed nations and rapidly developing nations kind of compete to create this clean energy technology that's going to help us meet our goals under the Paris Agreement, is that going to be available to some developing countries that really need it? Are they going to receive those patents directly? Are they going to receive some funds to help offset the cost of those technologies? So that's another really important aspect of the Paris Agreement. But as far as the most important thing, or I guess the most visible thing that'll come out of Marrakech, I think it depends on what you care about, what country you're from, what industry you're in. So it's all, I think it's all important.
Okay. Great. So we got a couple of questions from Thomas, one from a while ago and one recent. So Thomas asked, will the issue of subsidies going to fossil fuel producers in many nations be an issue at the talks?
So this, I think, this is sort of a national level issue, and I'm not entirely sure, but I do not think that this topic specifically is going to be discussed at Marrakech. I think that maybe you'll see this as part of nationally determined contributions from different countries, but subsidies that's something that national governments will give to their industries. So yeah, I'm not sure that specifically will be discussed at Marrakech.
So, which actually brings me to the second question that Thomas raised, because different nations might choose to treat their obligations differently, but and this is Thomas's suggestion, without a global government, something that has teeth and that can enforce global action, can you really expect something revolutionary to happen? Or if not, like, what are our chances?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so so I think the closest thing that we have right now to an international government is the UNFCCC. And I think you walk a very thin line between a legal instrument that really has teeth and getting many nations on board for action itself. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that if you have a legal instrument that is too stringent and tries to prescribe too much what a certain country should do, then you will probably find that you're not going to get as many countries on board for doing something on climate action. But then the flip side of that, or the other side of the argument, is that, okay, yeah, we have everybody on board, but this is sort of like a fluffy kind of agreement that we have. Countries are required to submit their nationally determined contributions, but they're not actually required to stick to those NDCs. So who's to say that that we'll see any action at all? And as far as it's just hard as far as like international law goes to I guess sort of like punish countries if they're not meeting their agreement. So I guess there would have to be a lot of work and a lot of like institution building in order for there to be some kind of like international government that can enforce something more specifically. And even if that were to come out of the UNFCCC, I don't think it would be something that is very politically salient to the member countries. So, like I said, it's a very thin line that you walk. But it's a great question, and I think it's something that a lot of people wonder about, and that maybe we should talk about a little bit more.
Well, depending on how things turn out tomorrow, there might be a US president in a few months who has very different ideas of the US's responsibilities, right? So what is the worst case scenario? Like, let's say the US pulls out, or some other, like China does. I mean, what safeguards do we have to make sure that there's a global commitment, even in the absence of roguish behavior, if that ever happens?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I guess the one thing that we have to fall back on is that the Paris Agreement itself has already been ratified, and it's been ratified ahead of schedule. So what needed to happen in order for ratification to happen is you needed to have at least 55 member countries that comprise 55% of global emissions signed on to the agreement. And so we already have that. So the Paris Agreement is already in force, technically. But I'm honestly not sure how exactly the United States would pull out of something that they've technically already ratified. I mean, I guess, you can, if you're the president of the United States, there's checks and balances and everything like that, but there's probably a way that you can pull out. I'm not, and the other part of that is the United States comprises a large percentage of global carbon dioxide emissions. So if they were to pull out of the Paris Agreement, then I'm not sure if you would get to that 55% of global emissions that you need for ratification. You would hope that enough enough of the other member countries would sign on to hit that mark. But that's sort of one thing that we fall back on. Worst case scenario is, I guess, that the Paris Agreement is no longer ratified. And even if that happens, then we sort of go back to square one to where we were before COP21. And that's with just having the Kyoto Protocol in force and just having the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's not going to change. So we just sort of be back to square one. That, I think, that's my idea of what the worst case scenario would be.
I mean, Kurt points out that if the US or some other country just says, we're not going to follow through on our NDC commitments, then there's nothing anyone else can do, right?
Right. So, I mean, like I said, there's no legal instrument that says a country needs to stick to its nationally determined contribution, but it needs to submit something that's credible every 5 years, and they need to participate. If they're a member party to the Paris Agreement, then they need to participate in that global stocktake. And that just sort of sets up a framework for kind of changing norms across countries. And like I was mentioning before, it inserts some kind of accountability into the process. So it's all just like very kind of soft and fluffy instruments for global action. But hopefully it's enough. I think it's really hopeful that all 196 member countries did come together over the Paris Agreement after many long nights of negotiating. But they did reach an agreement. I mean, we're talking about worst case scenarios, like you said, but the fact that there is a Paris Agreement at all, like at some point in time, I think that's hopeful.
Thanks so much, Katie. I actually have to end my participation in a minute, but Mark will help us close out. But in the meantime, if you have any final thoughts to share with the audience for posterity, this will live on for the next 15,000 years in some archives. So.
Sure. So I guess the one last thing I'll say that we did not get to talk about yet is how do citizens like us impact something that's so high up at this international level? And, in places where you have democracy, one thing, the way that democracy is supposed to work is that your government representatives are supposed to be representing the interests of the people. So that's where public engagement is so important in the form of grassroots movements, of civil society groups, of voting. You can't forget that government officials have this responsibility to do what it is that the public wants. Like I said, at least that's the way that a democracy is supposed to work. So just staying engaged with as much as you can with climate action on the local level. That's eventually going to move up the ranks, and that's going to influence what happens at the international level. If there's no support at home for climate action, then there's no reason for the negotiating representative of your country to go to the UNFCCC and to advocate for climate action on the global stage. So just keep doing what you're doing, keep voting, make climate change, or make sure that your congressional representatives and those that are involved in subcommittees on environment and homeland security and energy independence and climate change, make sure that they know that there's citizens out there who are concerned about these issues. So I guess that's the takeaway that I'll leave with everybody.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. That was super informative. And we really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you to Robert and Thomas and Zhengwen and Kurt, everybody for contributing. And I'd encourage, I'm going to put a link out on the chat line, but go to ClimateX. There's no reason we can't keep this conversation going. And I'm sure that Katie will be really happy to respond to any other questions, especially for those of you who couldn't tune in and are watching this after it's been posted. So please use the ClimateX site to keep the conversation going. And for those of you in the US, vote tomorrow. And thanks to everybody.